One way we might think of this text we just heard from the gospel is that the devil is trying to get Jesus to forget who he is. And Jesus does not forget who he is or where he has been or where he is headed. But the people of Israel, of which Jesus was a part, did, on a regular basis, forget where they had been. Much of what we read in Scripture, as you pay attention to it, are stories that are the people of Israel telling themselves what God has already done in the past to remind them during the present struggle that God will show up. On Wednesday night, on Ash Wednesday, we heard from the prophet Joel, and Joel said, "Tell your children and their children and the next generation." It's a way of saying we have to keep telling the stories of how God has been present so that we can remember in these times of struggle that God is present. But the people of Israel did have a short memory, and they would forget. When they left slavery out into the wilderness, pretty quickly, somebody said, "Can we go back?" Living in the wilderness where God was feeding them by day and giving them just enough water to drink, there was a fair bit of uncertainty, was too much for some. They would rather go back to the horrible slavery that they were in than live with that uncertainty, even as God was providing for them. They forgot what that was like. Now imagine 40 years in the wilderness. There were probably some who started that journey and didn't finish. There were probably some who were born, lived, and died before they got to the promised land. There were some like Moses who were there for the whole trip, right, but then didn't get to cross that river. But then there were those who landed in the promised land. And then they started to farm and make their own crops. Now, my grandma lived through the Depression, and I could tell, right? Like if you went to my grandma's house, the amount of stuff she reused, recycled, didn't throw away, didn't spend money on because she had lived through that time, that stuck with her. So you can bet that that first generation that lived on the land that God had sent them to, the land flowing with milk and honey, remembered what it was like in the wilderness to have to collect your manna every day and have to be led bit by bit along the way being provided for by God. But then there comes another generation who hears the stories about the wilderness but wasn't in the wilderness. And then there comes another generation who maybe doesn't even hear the same stories about the wilderness. And if you go far enough along, you get to a generation who doesn't remember the wilderness at all. They don't remember where they have come from. They don't remember that God is the one who provides. They don't remember that the abundance of the land that they have comes from God. So where do they probably begin to think it comes from? Themselves, right? Their hard work. It's easy to look around and say, well, last year we added this many more acres. We broke new land. And our neighbor figured out a way to irrigate a little different, but then I improved on it, and now look at the yields we get. Right? Pretty soon it becomes pretty easy to celebrate the work we are doing because maybe they forget that the God of the wilderness is also the God that gives them the abundance in that place. And if you begin then to think that it's all your work that's making this happen, you can start to look at the people around you who aren't working very hard and say, well, you probably should work harder if you want to experience the kind of abundance that we have. And in the story we hear today from Deuteronomy, it mentions at the end aliens and Levites. Aliens would have been immigrants that did not have a share in the land that the tribes were given. And the Levites were the tribe who were meant to be the priestly people, and they also did not have a share in the land, right? So if you're the one that's doing all the work, and then there's this, I don't know, maybe a priest was lazy sitting around living off of your hard work. At some point, are you getting a little irritated about that? Maybe. I don't know, right? The point being, if we forget where we came from and forget God's presence along the way, pretty soon we can start to think that it's all up to us. And that can be in our success, but also can be in the struggle. When the harvest isn't great, you start to go, gosh, what am I doing wrong? And look at all the pressure I have to feed my family and feed these other people, right? And so you got these people of Israel several generations on, perhaps have forgotten where they came from, who they are, and whose they are in terms of God's people. Now, I'm asking you to imagine that. I don't really have to imagine this very hard. I am thoroughly suburban. I've spent my entire life in the suburbs. But this summer, I visited a little church in Minnesota and found the photocopy of a letter written by a pastor in the 1800s about my great-great-great-grandparents leaving Norway to come to America. They were the age I am now. And they left everything they knew to go to a place where they did not know the language. They were farmers, to go farm land that was new and different in a climate that was different, all new stuff. Do you think they remembered what that voyage was like? Probably. The next generation, farmers. By the time you get to my grandpa, he was the butcher. My mom grew up on a farm. I still remember the one summer we were there when they decided to butcher chickens while we were there. For a suburban kid, that was horrifying. And then chicken was for dinner. And we were like, no, chicken comes from the store, right? This summer I found out that my dad also knew how to butcher chickens. But I don't remember any of that, right? Because I grew up with not quite like big box stores like we have now, but they came when I was young enough, right? There's always been plenty of places to get food. I don't have to know how to kill it and clean it and do all that myself, right? So I'm a little bit removed from the farm. Only one generation, right? But it's easy to forget. And I'm quite a bit distanced from the people that had to move and travel and be the immigrants. So as I forget those things, right, then you start to forget the journey that had to be there and the ways that God might have had to be present along the way. I'm also cognizant that forgetting where we came from might be a luxury of having abundance, right? If your ancestors came here not on a boat that they chose to get on, but on a slave ship, you don't forget in the same way maybe I do about that journey because the impacts of that slavery continue to be with us. If your ancestors were here, indigenous peoples that got killed and removed from their land and boxed into reservations with treaty after treaty broken and continuing to happen to this day, you also don't have the luxury of forgetting in the way that I can forget, right? Because of the journey that I've been on and the abundance that often lands in. So if we forget and then we start to think that it's all up to us, that our success is ours and that our failures are ours and all the rest of that, we can end up in a pretty individual space where we maybe don't look to God and maybe don't need God. Now, when things go bad, when we don't have anything else left in the tank to do it ourselves, in those hard times, it's easy to pick up the stories in Scripture and go, oh, right, return to the Lord your God, who was slow to anger and gracious and merciful. Yes, in those times of struggle, that may be all we have. But what if it's not a time of struggle? What if it's a time of abundance, where things are going well? What if it's a time where maybe it's not terrible, but it's kind of in between? What then? What is it that calls us back to God? Well, today, that's what we get in Deuteronomy. It is a command from God that is shared with the people that at the beginning of the harvest time, they are going to come forward and bring their first fruits. Now, in those 11 verses that we heard, how many times did it say the Lord your God? 12. Oh, you kept counting past that. Gotcha. Good work. 9 and a half if you count the God, comma, the Lord. So 9 times in 11 verses. And it reads, when you hear it, it almost sounds cumbersome. You will take to the Lord your God your offerings, and the priest that is on duty for the Lord your God, and the Lord your God, and the Lord your God, and the Lord your God. I've been heard somewhere that if you want people to hear something, you have to announce it or share it like 5 times, which is why we communicate so many ways that we do. Which, little sidelight, then people go, how come we didn't know about this? You got to read the stuff we send you, that's why. Right? But so if it's 5 times for us, 9 times the Lord your God, which tells us that something about this text is about reminding the people who they were and where they had come from. Now, I want you to imagine what this looks like, because the harvest is happening. I would bet that some of them waited a little bit longer to bring the crops in than others because they thought they read the weather better. Some of them maybe worked a little faster than others, so maybe not on every day was everyone's harvest the same. But as they were bringing in those first fruits, the story tells us that they were then told to go to where the priest is, to the place of the Lord your God, and bring your first fruits, right? That first 10%. and present yourself there. Now, if you imagine that everyone is harvesting about the same time, I would bet that some of them got up early and said, there's going to be a line. So I'm going to go now, bright and early. And then they get there and find out that somebody camped out overnight. And so then there's a whole line all around the temple. And then the person that got there first brings their basket. The priest comes out. And then they set the basket down in front of the priest, which is what they're told to do. And then they say to the priest, a wandering Aramean was my ancestor. He went down into Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number. And there he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor on us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. And he brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. So now I bring the first fruit of the ground that you, O Lord, have given me. And after the first one said that, the second one came and set their basket down and said, a wandering Aramean was my ancestor, and gave that whole same speech. And then the next one, a wandering Aramean was my ancestor, whole same speech. Why do they all have to say that? It's because we forget where we came from. And in that little speech, right, as they brought forward their offerings and first fruits, it reminds them that they once were aliens themselves. It reminds them that they were in Egypt where they suffered under oppression and affliction, that God was the one that led them out of all of that, and that God is the one that's responsible for their abundance. Does God need their offerings to get by? No. This is for them to be reminded that even when things are going well, or even if the harvest is meager, that God is still present. And when you bring those first fruits forward and have to account for all of that, you get reminded where you came from, even if it was generations ago, and also who God is, who you are, and whose you are. Now, God perhaps could have said, after all the harvest is done, take whatever you don't use and bring it to the temple. How much would have made it to the temple? Probably not a lot, right? Because there's always something that you can spend your stuff on, right? There's always a need that pops up. So from the beginning, God is looking at them and saying, this is a reminder for you about who I am, right? And that makes it, in a way, a gift. It's a gift of a story. It's a gift of a way of living that says we're going to give first fruits to God, even if we're not sure we can afford it, so that we can remember whose we are, where we have come from, how we got here, and that God continues to be with us. I think the same is true for us. Could you imagine, by the way, if every Sunday you all had to come up here and give that whole speech before we got to communion, right? Everybody brought their offering forward, set it down up here and said, a wandering Aramean was my ancestor. And then, but it's been a long time, so I could add, and a wandering Norwegian, or, you could add your own bits. We'd be here for a while. But this is the invitation that we have, right? Whenever we talk about money in the church, somebody always says we talk about money too much. I was once in a men's Bible study, and one of the guys looked and said, you pastors shouldn't have to give anything. We should all give money to fund the church. And it was the first sort of inkling I had that giving is a spiritual practice that has nothing to do with funding the church, because it does the same thing for us. Giving our first fruits, before we even know if we can afford to do so, is a way of reminding us where we have been, where God's people have been, and where God shows up. Now, after that, then the church has to do something with that, right? Well, the text tells us, after you have brought forth the harvest, and you've given the story, right, a wandering Aramean, it then says, go and celebrate with the Levites and the aliens that are among you. So after you have brought your first fruits, now go and share. with the people that don't have a share in the land and a share in the abundance. The people who might not count, right, if you're trying to pay attention to who is in the community and who is not. So that all at once we have this invitation to give and to share as a reminder, right, that God is the one that has gotten us where we are. Now, as a congregation, then, we have resources. And what did we try to do with them? Share, right? We tried to feed hungry people. We tried to be in a presence in the community that shares grace with people. And it's expensive to keep a building, but a building gives us an anchor out of which to do mission in the community, right? So all of this fits in that space. But it really does land in the space of spiritual practice. It's about my relationship with God and trusting in the Lord and believing that this really is a gift of a reminder and a gift of grace. It's not an obligation. It's not something we should feel guilty if we can't do it. It is all an invitation into relationship. So that when I first had a pastor challenge us to tithe, we had been blessed and abundant. But I told you, I forget where I came from pretty quickly, right? And so that invitation was absolutely transformative and continues to be so. And so as we hear this story today, I always want to remind us that we have these waters that are also a reminder of Jesus' death and resurrection that give us life. We also have this table that is a reminder of the forgiveness that grows out of these waters of Jesus journeying with us. And we have our offerings, which are a reminder of the gift of life that we have, that God is always with us, continues to be with us. Even if we forget where we were, God gives us opportunities to be reminded of just that. Amen. And between now and communion, I invite you to find page 141 in one of those pew Bibles. And our offertory prayer today is going to be, guess what? A wandering Aramean. If you're at home, it's Deuteronomy 26, 1 to 11.